Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Schroh, and I began my career at History San Jose in July of 2019. I had 6 months on the job before COVID shut down the world. So I'm still learning the history of our area. My fascination with history museums came from my grandmother when I was a kid. She used to take us all over the place. My grandfather used to drive everywhere, but he refused to go inside. He would sit outside in the car and smoke cigarettes and drink coffee. I have that vivid memory of him always doing that. But she always took us on tour. And her story is one of the first stories that, in the Untold stories that I came across. In 1996, a gentleman named Samuel Friedman decided to write a book called The Inheritance. It was how 3 families and America moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and beyond. And he wanted to follow 3 immigrant families, an Irish, a Polish, and an Italian, and how one generation was Roosevelt Democrats, and now their grandchildren were Reagan Republicans. But in that book, my grandmother story was told, and that kind of clicked my love of the Untold story to learn, because I didn't know, she's grandma, but all of a sudden you learn all these things about her life that you never heard of, that were written down in the book. She didn't tell us, of course, but she had no problem sitting down with an historian and telling her whole story. But anyway, I began my career at Van Cortlandt Manor. I'm from the East Coast. I just moved, as I said, here 3 years ago. So California is still a brand new thing to me. I worked at a site called Van Cortlandt Manor. It's an Anglo-Dutch site. And one of the first things I noticed when I started doing the tours there was, we told the story about the family that lived there, about the white Dutch Anglo family that lived there. But in the background were the enslaved African Americans. They were just mentioned. And that really started to trigger me, like, wait a minute, why are they just there? But why are they not part of the narrative? So this was my first thing. The next place I worked at was called Liberty Hall Museum in Union, New Jersey. It was the home of the first governor of New Jersey, William Livingston, and home of the Kane family until 1995. So as an historian and as a museum person, it was a treasure. 250 years of a family's history that's never been touched. If you ever read the book Great Expectations, it was Mrs. Havisham's house. It was just covered in cobweb. It just was frozen in time at 1995. So as I started pulling that tour together and pulling things together again, all of a sudden I realized in the background, here's enslaved African Americans, here's freed blacks, here's new immigrants from Europe that are their servants. Why are their stories not part of the narrative? So that tour I was able to write myself entirely, and they were brought to the forefront. It was at that time that I decided I created what I call the reverse pyramid. I used to also teach at Kane University in their public history program. In that program, I taught social studies education majors that are going to be teachers in the classroom. And I felt that they needed to understand this as well. The reverse, I show them a pyramid with George Washington on the top, Martha, then her children, then the servants in his house, and then the enslaved African Americans on Mount Vernon. I flipped it. And I said, George Washington couldn't have done everything he did without all of these levels of people that made it possible for him to run off and fight a war, because someone else was managing his household. So I wanted it to be an equal playing field. So this is a pyramid that I use, and everything we kind of look at now. We look at all the different levels of history. Once I realized that this needed to change, and histories needed to encompass all people's stories, I was looking for a new job, and I found History San Jose. I came out to California, and I was completely bowled away. Not just for History San Jose, but what it represents today. History San Jose represents a museum of museums and a cultural campus. Not only do we tell the history of San Jose and the Santa Clara Valley, but we have what's called an affiliates program. And part of that affiliates program is groups that have museums on our campus that tell their stories. So we have an African American heritage house. It's the African American community. They run that house. They tell their story. And when you go in there, you see African Americans. You don't see me telling the African American story. You see African Americans. We have a Chinese temple, and it's the Chinese community that tells their story. We have the La Raza Historical Society, where you can learn about a little later, one of their members is here, but they tell the Mexican and the Spanish story of the community. We have a Viet museum that tells the Vietnamese boat people story. And it just continues in all the various stories. And I think these are so important because it's a way to tell these untold stories and get them out there to the public in different ways than the norm. Another thing that I felt that we have 2 museums that are part of History San Jose that are in downtown San Jose at the San Pedro Square Market. One of them is called the Peralta Adobe, and the other one is called the Thomas Fallon House. Well, they were called that because one of the good things about COVID, I was able to do a lot of historical research. I got down into the archives and I studied, and I was like, wait a minute, this is called the Peralta Adobe. He didn't build it. Someone lived there for 20 years. Where's his name? Why is it not called the Gonzalez Adobe? So what I've done, we've changed the name, and now it's the Gonzalez Peralta Adobe, and it tells Jose's story as well as the Peralta family that runs it. So both stories, and all of a sudden this gentleman who was a Native American who came over with the Dan's expedition, there was a scout that was one of the first mayors of the San Jose under the Spanish. Now his story has been brought to the level as well. Now across the street, as I mentioned, there's the Thomas Fallon House. Did he live there alone? Did he have a wife? I know there's lots of kids, so there had to be a wife. So we've changed the name of that as well. The house is now the Cremella, her name first, because it was really her fortune that built that house. She was a Rancho Californio, Mexican, Spanish heritage family's been here for generations before Thomas Fallon ever attended. The point is that these stories need to come out, and that's what we're doing in History San Jose. We're bringing these stories out, and I just want to wrap up with one new thing that we've added. We have an immigration program that we do for our school kids, and I have a new dynamic director of education. We sat down and I said, I want stories told that we're not telling. So when you take that tour now, you hear the story of a Chinese boy who came over, an actual person, not just, they're the Chinese that came over and they were immigrants, named Yang Wang Gong. You hear the story of a Portuguese refugee that came over in 1958 with the volcanic and the immigration policy, Mary Carena. You hear a Mexican guest worker story in the 1950s that came here to work, Manuel Montes Robed. And then you also hear the story of a Vietnamese refugee's mother that came here in the 1980s, Tai Hung. She took the name Anna, an anglicized name, Hung, that came here. So you actually meet real people that are part of our immigration story. And that's what I'm trying to get across at History San Jose. Get those unknown stories out there, and so people can connect to these stories. Good? Sorry.
Hello again. My name is Felicia Smith, and I am the Racial Justice and Social Equity Librarian here at Stanford. And like Bill, my motto is to make the unknown known. And so I'm going to talk to you today about my project that is No Systemic Racism. I created the Say Their Names, No More Names exhibit at Stanford Libraries. It's online, and we had a banner outside that had the No Justice, No Peace, and that's spelled, yay! And I spelled it K-N-O-W intentionally. So I couldn't do it without my team and my interns, especially. A lot of people in the library helped me create the Say Their Names exhibit as well. But I just want to make sure I talk a little bit about how the No Systemic Racism project came about. It originated in the Say Their Names, No More Names exhibit, which, by the way, has been translated into Chinese, is in the process of being translated into Spanish, and will be translated into German. So we can share these stories with a wider community. But in the Say Their Names, No More Names exhibit, there's a section called 3 T's, and that is systemic racism. And what that is I didn't want to get people to get lost in the individual stories. I highlight 65 stories in that exhibit that represent the different types of violence that Black people face. But I didn't want people to get lost in realize and forget that this is systemic. And so in the Say Their Names exhibit, I have the 3 T's of systemic racism. As an example, of where the government has admitted to systemically discriminating against Black people. I'm not going to argue whether or not systemic racism exists. I can document it as a librarian. So, yes. And so, so the 3 T's include Chicago paid reparations to over 100 Black men who were systematically tortured by Police Commander John Burge. Of course, President Clinton apologized to the survivors of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and the police chief in Tulsa apologized for the police who took part in the Tulsa Black Wall Street massacre. And so I have a blog post that introduces the No Systemic Racism Project in great detail. So I won't go into that, but basically I wanted to show how all of the different areas of people's lives interconnect, and all of these different systemic racism entities and institutions compound to cause harm to Black people. So in the example of Stephon Clark, I have the Stephon Clark law that resulted from his murder. I have the police manuals from the Sacramento Police Department. I have the census records. I have the broken windows policing call that brought the police to him. And so, again, and as part of my No Systemic Racism project, which I will call KSR from now on, I figured it's easier to start with low-hanging fruit. So I can start with places that people have admitted to and apologized. So Alameda County apologized for slavery and racial segregation. As you may have all heard with the Reparations Task Force, they're returning Bruce's Beach that was stolen from Willa and Charles Bruce in 1920. It was over 100 years ago, but they're finally returning that oceanfront property to the descendants. And City of Glendale apologized for being a sundown town. If you're not from the South like my family, you may not know what a sundown town is, and that's where Black people had to be out of town before the sun went down, or there would be violence. And so we have a draft website just for our internal use to kind of figure out what it would look like once we actually launch. So on the draft website, we have 3 main areas: the documenting systemic racism instances in California specifically, but also nationwide, because of course I have to include Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, but we're focusing in the pilot on California. And so there's a timeline, and then there's an area where you can search, because we are a library, so you can search for information about racism. And then there's a section called Get Involved, because once you realize that systemic racism exists, I didn't want you to feel powerless. I want people to do something. I don't want to just talk about it. And so there's an example of, you can join the band calling for an end to no-knock warrants. And this is an example of one of our timeline entries when Blacks were prevented from testifying in court, which made me think earlier in the plenary session, Susan Anderson talked about Charlotte Brown, who and the segregated streetcars. That's in our timeline. And actually, Charlotte Brown was kicked off of the omnibus streetcar not once, but twice. And after she sued the first time, she was awarded $25, and they reduced it to 5 cents, I think, which was the cost of the streetcar fare. But then a few days later, she got back on the omnibus streetcar, and they dragged her off again. So she sued them again. And that led to the landmark 1964 case where the judge called segregation barbaric. So I just think that was interesting that she mentioned that in her plenary. And again, the point of my No Systemic Racism project is to show how all of these systems build on themselves. So we're focusing on housing and policing, but there's a lot of research out there about housing and policing systemic racism. I want to show how they all interconnect. And so one area where housing and policing intersects is broken windows policing, no-knock warrants, civil asset forfeitures. So I want to expand the conversation in the way people think about this. So again, the point of this, the whole reason I'm doing this is I want to humanize the harm. I want to use data and stories to show that all of these systems are, again, interconnected, but they're combining to hurt Black people and cause real harm. That noose that was found on campus, the 3rd one in 3 years, that causes real harm. So I need to be able to take that data and make it meaningful. And again, these are just some of the areas: pollution, nutrition, education, healthcare, banking, subprime loans. And again, focusing on the Bay Area, the racial segregation in the Bay Area is not by accident. It is a result of extrajudicial violence, exclusionary zoning, racially restrictive covenants that prohibited Black people from buying houses in those deeds, and urban renewal, racial steering, block busting, as well as another project working on, not just housing, but also policing, right? So I'm doing something that was inspired by a project at the UNC library. They are tracking Jim Crow language in North Carolina laws, so we're going to do that for California. So we've already started that, and again, we want to trace the legacy of Jim Crow in our history, in our laws, and again, there was the law that prohibited black people from testifying against white people, but how that all traces today and relates to mass incarceration, the police industrial complex, the disparities in criminal justice that exist today. And part of the point I'm making is people think California has this great history as this liberal paradise, but they were founded as a so-called free state, but that promise was not kept because there were enslaved people here at the time. And so I want to, again, make those unknown stories known. And the last thing I want to say is, again, the whole point of my No Systemic Racism project is very simple. I want to document systemic racism instances and use that data to show all of these other invisible interconnections to prove that systemic racism exists, but then also to visualize and tell these stories in a way that humanizes the harm. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tom Izu, and I'm here with Susan Hayase. We're co-directors of the Hidden Histories Project of San Jose, Japantown. The project utilizes augmented reality art to allow people to experience hidden layers of history, culture, and culture while walking through the streets of Japantown. It was funded through augmented reality, I just want to make sure everybody knows, is a technology that allows you to look through your smartphone's camera view and see images, hear sounds, overlaid on the reality that you're experiencing already. It was funded through a National Knight Foundation grant for the immersive technology in the arts, and the Japanese American Museum of San Jose served as a fiscal agent, and that's the building there. The goal of the project was to deepen the community's sense of place and build a sense of unity among its very diverse constituents. And the project is not about creating an augmented reality product, but is about organizing local artists, historians, tech people, to use for the sake of the community to oppose gentrification and assimilation.
When I was a student at Stanford in the late 70s, nobody talked about San Jose, except to dismiss it as a suburban wasteland. But many people may not know, and I didn't know then, that in San Jose, a unique neighborhood-based community called Japantown existed. Fewer still may know that the place called Japantown isn't just about Japanese restaurants, but is actually a physical manifestation of layers of overlapping histories of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino-American life. And it's actually a living history lab, imbued with the hidden stories of these three communities stretching back over 135 years. And these stories, however, are threatened with complete erasure by the continuing pressures of assimilation and now face even further destruction by forces of encroaching gentrification.
Another hidden aspect of this shared physical space and multi-ethnic space is how it came to be. It arose through episodes of exclusion, segregation, expulsion in ways similar to what many other communities of color have faced in this country under white supremacy. Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrants overlapped in time and space, and they built businesses, social institutions, gathered together in the small area of north of downtown. This was due to de facto segregation, captured here by the Homeowners Loan Corporation map, and report that accompanies it states the area was, quote, hazardous for investments due to the large concentration of, quote, Orientals and Negroes, unquote. The map in red, later known as the redlining maps, contains both what is now known as the Japantown neighborhood at the north end and a historic black neighborhood at the southern end.
To build a shared sense of place, community, and identity, we created a grassroots-based collaboration between community artists of various ages and experience with the assistance of selected community history advisors and AR, art, and tech people. This involved personal sharing, discussion, and tech training. We also used an open source app developed by two of our AR art technical advisors. The Hidden Histories artists created their works based on the stories they learned from the advisors and through research supported by the project. Here's an example. From historian Connie Young Yu, the artist heard descriptions of the Yingxinggung Temple in the Highlandville Chinatown that served Chinese immigrant workers from miles around. And from advisor Robert Ragsack, who was born in Japantown, then called Chinatown, the artist heard the emotion of losing the Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino businesses on 6th Street when the city of San Jose razed them. Out of these treasured memories and feelings, artist Kiki Wu created a beautiful and subversive image of the Yingxinggung Temple on its old site, and artist Takeshi Moro created an installation of temple flags of all colors raining down on the old Highlandville Chinatown, now occupied by a high-density housing complex. This is powerful art to erase the erasure.
What resulted was the creation of 19 AR art layers by 9 artists throughout Japantown neighborhood, currently visible using a free downloadable app at any time of the day or night. Artist Anna Wong's layers, for example, has Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino farmers showing common agricultural roots. Kelly Nishimura's layer asked probing questions about what was in the minds of local Japanese Americans as they were rounded up and based on ancestry and sent to the concentration camps during World War II. Lucy and Kubo's layer is an immersive collage and soundtrack of the people, events, culture, and activism from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that shaped today's Japantown. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Al. Hi. Thank you so much for asking me to be here today, Josh and Natalie. It's an honor. In 2020, Josh, Natalie, 2 recent alums, and I co-founded the Disability at Stanford Oral History Project, for which I'm project manager. A bit of background. In 1978, the year before I graduated from Stanford, the Stanford Historical Society founded its oral history program. 40 plus years and more than 800 oral histories later, the OHP holds 35 projects. Among these is the Disability at Stanford Oral History Project. In 2014, Josh sets out to document the history of disability advocacy on campus. He and Rosa Gonzalez of the Diversity and Access Office gather early 1990s reports related to Stanford's ADA compliance, outreach materials pertaining to recruiting, and student activist materials. Josh and Chloe Keller's at Power to Act later share the digital files of this student-run disability advocacy group. These fill in some major gaps in disability advocacy documented history. In January 2020, I emailed Josh and Natalie. I mentioned I have Crohn's disease, that my time at Stanford might have been eased by a disability presence on campus. And what about doing an oral history project on disability? I wanted to give others the voice I never had. Josh tells me, Al, this is so important. For those 5 words, Josh, thank you. We rally the troops, the pandemic breaks out. A steering committee forms to establish goals, guidelines, and procedures. We follow standard oral history methodology, including, as I've learned, conducting training sessions for interviewers, transcribers, and editors, researching and reaching out to interviewees, and of course, post-interview work. For more on oral history methodology, I direct you to the workshop conducted by Natalie, who I'm honored to say has become my mentor, colleague, and friend these last few years. As of today, 5 interviewers have conducted a total of 21 Zoom interviews with people in the Stanford community. Each interviewer has a disability and/or is the parent of 1 or more children with disabilities. The disabilities represented among our interviewees include hearing and visual impairments, OCD, depression and anxiety, muscular dystrophy, severe allergies, and spinal cord injuries, among many others. Some interviewees were born with disabilities, others acquired them before they came to Stanford and/or at Stanford. As with all Stanford OHP projects, our interviews will be available in audio and written formats. We hope to release our first installment of them in the next year or so and to do a presentation on campus about the project. The main goals of the Disability at Stanford Oral History Project are, quote, to document the personal histories of students, staff, faculty, and alums with disabilities at Stanford, and how those experiences shape them on campus and beyond, and to chronicle the history of disability advocacy at Stanford, including its roots, current status, and future goals. So here's what the project has taught us about Stanford's disability advocacy history to date, a little bit of it. Generations of people at Stanford have advocated for more exposure, acceptance, and access for the disabled community. Simply put, if not for them, there'd be no advocacy history to record. We've repeatedly heard about efforts to establish a campus community center for students with disabilities. A sense emerges of each generation reinventing the community center wheel. Undergrads, for example, usually stay for 4 years, and when they leave, lost momentum, information, contacts, and continuity for these efforts are left behind. FYI, if you don't know, the Pilot Student Center DISCO, as in Disability Community, just opened this year on campus. What the project teaches about living with disability. The theme of isolation emerged early on and often and was amplified by the pandemic. Interviewees expressed frustration with their non-disabled peers who'd never experienced sequestering for long periods, or who repeatedly asked, when will this pandemic end, when so many disabilities never end? As one interviewee said, she wanted to tell some of her friends, welcome to my world. Balancing these stories are those of resilience, creativity, and humor. We learn how activism and engagement, technology advances, and the support of a parent, a professor, a university archivist foster communication and connection. This evolving collection deepens our perspective in its telling of behind-the-scenes disability-related experiences on campus. For example, it's the 2007-08 academic year. A freshman who uses a scooter is on the 2nd floor of a classroom building. She is outside the elevator. In her words, excerpted, quote, after class one day, the elevator wouldn't work. I could call, but unfortunately, I found the systems that had been set up don't understand the urgency of these situations. I could not get out of the building. It was getting dark. I was on hold for a long time. Whoever it was, they just didn't get. I'm stuck here. The TA waited with me. I think there was one other student who was there waiting with me. Thank goodness I was not alone. I was very shaken and rattled. I tried to be calm. I don't remember if I cried. At some point, I don't remember how long we waited, but he, the TA, said, "I'll just carry you." He carried me down the stairs. He probably put me down, and then he and the other person carried my scooter down. That's how I got out. A story from the 1980s. Then Stanford President Donald Kennedy has asked this staff member to speak at his regular meeting with the deans of the schools and other senior officers. Again, excerpted. I think I have just been appointed the Director of Disability Services, or whatever title they gave me. I was probably 26 or 27. I was a kid. I had long hair, a beard, and boy, I was nervous as heck. I gave this 45 to 60-minute presentation beginning with the nuts and bolts and really going to what, to me, was the real goal, to recognize the social and cultural issues around disability and to integrate those into the developing campus life and curriculum issues we were trying to address. If we're going to address world culture, we have to realize this as well, that disability is a civil rights issue, it is an identity issue, and it's an important part of life. It needs to be an essential part of what our campus is about physically, socially, and academically. I finished, and one of the deans turned to me and said in front of this room of 20 people, "Son, are you a grad student or what?" Don Kennedy walked over, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, "This guy is leading us where we need to go, and we are going to do this." And the room was quiet. That show of support and integrity, I'll never forget that. The next day, I cut my hair and put on a suit and tie. I've worn a suit and tie at work every day since. The project exists at the intersection of personal history, student advocacy, and the dynamics of institutional change. It contributes to institutional memory and helps us rethink how we do oral history in general, such as making our interview process more accessible. There's a lot more work to be done. If you've been involved with a similar project, I'd love to learn from you. Thank you.
All right, hello. My name is Ann K.D. Myers, and I'm a rare books cataloger in Stanford's Department of Special Collections and University Archives. In recent years, my work has included facilitating what has become a university-wide anti-racist description discussion group, where staff from a variety of campus libraries and cultural heritage collections can work together to develop anti-racist descriptive practices in our work. And this slide shows all the different departments that have been represented in our group so far. So what are anti-racist descriptive practices? They are part of a larger movement, sometimes referred to as ethical, critical, or reparative cataloging, which can apply to all forms of description: catalog records, archival finding aids, exhibits, LibGuides, blog articles, and so on. Anti-racist descriptive practices involve striving to move our descriptions beyond 19th century hierarchical systems of organizing information so as to avoid, to the extent possible, perpetuating harm to traditionally marginalized communities through our descriptions, and to represent those communities as accurately and inclusively as possible. Part of the impetus for developing anti-racist descriptive practices is libraries' reliance on Library of Congress subject headings. These headings are used to help library users find resources on the same topic, both within a single library as well as across libraries, but they are rife with outdated language, and changes can be slow in being adopted. You may be familiar with the years-long struggle to change the subject headings representing undocumented immigrants, which was depicted in the Change the Subject documentary. Anti-racist descriptive practices involve proposing changes to existing subject headings, proposing new, more representative subject headings, using alternative thesauri when the standard subject heading sources are inadequate or inappropriate, and adding more context and nuance in our descriptions whenever possible. So how have anti-racist descriptive practices been implemented at Stanford? We began by writing a statement on potentially harmful language in cataloging and archival description in special collections and university archives. This slide is a screenshot of that statement. In this statement, we begin, "We acknowledge that description is not neutral, nor are we. We aim to describe our materials in an informative and accurate manner that is respectful to the individuals and communities who create, use, and are represented in the collections we manage." We go on to commit to practices to address offensive or harmful language as part of our routine description work and to strive to prevent harm through our descriptive practices. In service to this commitment, we have begun a shared document of best practices for harmful language in catalog and archival records. This is the table of contents. We have studied certain topics and areas of description in depth, doing research into community preferences for descriptive language, sharing our findings with one another, and discussing how best to implement our findings locally. The result is guidelines which identify problematic subject headings and suggest alternatives, and which provide guidance on terms to use or avoid in other descriptive fields. Whenever possible, we use resources created by the communities in question to guide our decisions. The topics we have studied in depth so far include when and how to include content warnings in our descriptions, and recommended descriptive practices for Japanese American incarceration during World War II, LGBTQIA+ terms, and Native peoples. We have begun work on medical and disability terminology, slavery, and imperialism and colonialism, with many other topics on our list as well, as you can see. Our discussions around terminology for Native peoples also led to a working group which studied land acknowledgements and ultimately made recommendations to library and university leadership to encourage broader use of land acknowledgements in public events. Here's a screenshot of the library website on land acknowledgements. We also supported a separate library-wide initiative to provide a local alternative heading to the offensive Library of Congress subject heading, Illegal Aliens. Stanford's metadata and data control units worked to supply the local alternative, Undocumented Immigrants. This was done in concert with similar efforts at other libraries across the country prior to Library of Congress's eventual change to the official heading in November 2021. And we have consulted and shared resources with other groups on campus engaged in similar work, including the Law Library's DEI Committee, the Conservation Department, the Hoover Library and Archives, and Felicia's No Systemic Racism Project. As we move forward in this work, we are also hoping to find ways to get more community input in our work from Stanford faculty, students, and the wider community. As I mentioned, we rely on resources created by the communities we describe to guide our work, but we have not yet sought direct feedback on our interpretation of those resources. We strive to represent the spectrum of identities and perspectives in our collections and our descriptions of those collections, and to do so, we need to make sure we are hearing the spectrum of identities and perspectives as we research how best to represent them. This slide is a list of resources you may find helpful in your own work. And in conclusion, I'd like to say that there are, of course, many challenges in this work. The topics we discuss are often difficult and/or sensitive and may affect different members of our group in different ways. Some of us are less comfortable discussing these topics openly than others. There is an emotional cost, in addition to the intellectual work required. There are often no clear answers as to the right approach, since individual members of the communities we strive to represent have different preferences about whether and how they would like to be labeled, and it is often difficult, if not impossible, to determine how someone from the past might have preferred to be labeled. Our work will constantly change as language and understanding change. Our best practices document will never be done. It will always be a living document, adjusted as needed in response to community needs. But the rewards are many as well. The grassroots nature of this group and our work has meant that we have had staff participating from all levels of the organization and from units across the libraries and the university as a whole. For the first time, we have a forum where people engaged in similar work can compare experiences, share advice, and build community. And our work trickles out to other areas of the libraries as well, contributing to a cultural shift across the board and supporting other library-wide initiatives toward justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. As language continues to change, and as the communities represented in our collections continue to grow, we must also continue to grow and change, doing our best to reflect communities using their preferred terms when known, and in ways that do not further the harm already done by societal systems of oppression. Thank you.
I spoke earlier this morning. I'm Roberto Trujillo. I'm one of the associate university librarians at Stanford, and I'm also the director of special collections. In 1980, I was working then at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Stanford hired me as a consultant to evaluate their collections with regard to can the collections at Stanford support teaching and research in the area of Chicano studies at the doctoral level. So what I did was compile what I called an expert bibliography that listed existing published resources that dealt with Chicano studies. And I did it for a number of subject areas, and then I compared that bibliography to what was held at UCLA, at UC Berkeley, at the University of New Mexico, at the University of Texas at Austin, and then Stanford. Should I tell you what happened? It was embarrassing, but I was at a faculty club dinner to present my findings to a group of Chicano faculty and to the then library administration. And I asked them, do you want the good news or the bad news first? The Chicano faculty said the bad news. The library administration said the good news. I said, well, the bad news is that you have about a quarter of what you should have, 25%. The good news is that you could probably acquire all of that material for relatively little money. And you are Stanford, and you do have money. So it was kind of a weird thing to do, but I said, how can you, as an institution, begin to award, PhDs when you don't have library resources for those students to do their work? So they're going to have to run around the country to other libraries to do all of their work. And you should have some basic things, And so the question of, the cultural record and where does it belong? Another anecdote, I was making presentations to the board of directors for the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund in San Francisco. And I was making another presentation to the board of directors for what was then called the National Council of La Raza, which was in Washington, D.C. And I made a similar presentation to another group in San Francisco for the California Rural Legal Assistance Group. Stanford and I was interested in acquiring those organizational records for Stanford for support at the graduate level of research. Each of these groups was pretty rough on me. And they asked me, why should we give our records to big, bad, rich, white Stanford? And I said, oh, now what do I do? And so you have to think on your feet. And I said, well, shouldn't Stanford now, if not in the past, have a responsibility for acquiring these kinds of records, this cultural record? Shouldn't we now have a responsibility? We would presumably have the resources to do so. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here in front of you asking for them. I said, and that's not to suggest that in the past 75 years, Stanford ignored any sense of responsibility for collecting these kinds of materials, but now's now. And if you're also suggesting that because of Stanford's past history, that I shouldn't be at Stanford, I have a problem with that. If you're suggesting that the 10 Chicano faculty who are at Stanford shouldn't be there, I have a problem with that. If you're suggesting that the 15 or so hundred students that were of Mexican descent that were enrolled at Stanford at the time shouldn't be here, I have a problem with that. So I think, you guys, that it's our turn to be helpful, more than helpful. We should have the infrastructure and the capacity to deal with the historical record of Mexicans in the United States. We're in California. It is, the 1920s, 1980s. I said, you do have money. There are the students. There are a handful of faculty. Like, my God, we have to do this. And if you have your records deposited at a place like Stanford, they can start to live up to that responsibility. So that's been my perspective and my take on this ever since I got here. And it's a little weird because it's embarrassing to Stanford, kind of. On the other hand, what we have done in the last 40 years has been pretty impressive. And I remember when Ignacio Ornelas first came to my office, he had been using special collections, and he asked one of the people at the service desk in the reading room, why do you have all this Chicano stuff? And they said, oh, we really don't know. You got to go talk to Roberto Trujillo. He can tell you why and how and what. And then he came to my door and knocked on the door and introduced himself. And he said, I've been using these collections, and I want to thank you for having them at Stanford. He said, but I have a list of other people and other organizations for whom there is no home yet for their archival record. And I said, can I see your list? And he said, yes. And so he pulled it out. And I said, let me pull out my list. And I had a list of 100 or so people and organizations, and I was comparing his list to my list. And there were some same names on both of those lists. And so I asked him, where are you from? What are you doing here? You're not even a Stanford student. And so we became friends over this conversation. And then he said, well, I want to help you. And I said, okay, I need help. I can't do it by myself, And so we became collaborators in crime kind of ever since then. And I've been working with Ignacio, him with me, for a long time. And we've been building and acquiring more collections. And we've been, processing and cataloging and describing those collections. He has since finished his PhD and is teaching at a high school, but he still works with us. But these stories of where do our records belong, they belong at places like Stanford. They absolutely do. They belong at places like UC Berkeley, at UCLA, at USC. I mean, we're the gorillas in the mist here because we're big. And so those 4 institutions should all do this. I was at a panel discussion at Princeton University, and there was Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, and Stanford. None of those other 4 were dealing with this kind of collecting at all. And they had the audacity to ask me why I was doing it. Because they said, we don't collect what they called contemporary history. And I said, well, the problem is, we're in California, and people of Mexican descent have been there for like 300-something years. It's not really contemporary history. And if you're suggesting for a moment that they don't have a literature, a language, poetry, music, photography, diaries, if you don't think they don't have a cultural record, where have you been living? I said, I'm really, you guys are the cream of the crop for research institutions, and you're suggesting to me that because of what I'm doing, it's not worth it? And how do you not get mad? And I had to not get mad. because I was in a forum not unlike this where there were several hundred people and I couldn't afford to get pissed. So I asked the questions of, what are you doing to help collect this kind of historical and cultural record? And the woman who was most negative actually got up and apologized. And I said, thank you. But, where does our record belong? It belongs at institutions that are going to have the capacity to be there in 100 years, in 200 years. That's where we belong. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question for the last topic, which is, when does it belong at Stanford? Because I don't mean to push back, but I do think the communities have a lot better access to the records and to the materials when they're at some of these organizations than when they get sort of behind the ivory wall. So I recognize long-term it has to be at Stanford, but at what point do you decide that's the right time?
That's a really good question, and one that I get a lot. If you've got records that require access to them by people who are students, whether they're undergraduates or graduates, or even if they're in high school or a community college, and you can't provide that access to them, that's a problem. And so I would suggest that if they're in a library setting that people can get to, it's probably a better place to have them. That's not to suggest that you don't keep them for as long as you need them, but if you want them to be accessible for, a 10-page undergraduate paper or a dissertation, they probably belong in a university setting sooner rather than later. But it's a tough one because, as you probably experienced today, parking at Stanford's a hassle. Finding where in the library or which of the 15 libraries that we have your material is a hassle. Did you feel welcome driving onto campus? Did anybody welcome you here? Was there a little kiosk that told you where to park and where the library, and you have to pay for parking. What if you don't have the $7 or whatever it is that they charge? Those kinds of very practical things are issues. And do people feel welcome? I had, a group of 6th graders come from Salinas, and I gave them a tour of special collections, and I asked them, did you feel comfortable? And they were very intimidated coming to this institution, coming to this library, which is pretty cool. And they only felt comfortable when they saw what my name was. And one little girl said, Mr. Trujillo, are you Mexican? And I said, that's a complicated question because there's a Mexican and then there's a New Mexican, and I'm actually from New Mexico, and we don't call ourselves Mexicans, we call ourselves Nuevo Mexicanos. And there is a difference, and so I had to explain that difference to her, but she felt welcome. I said, and I do speak Spanish, and I am your size physically, and I do eat the same food that you do. And I do have an abuela and abuelo, and I do have tias and tios and primos. And so you make them feel welcome. But before that, they did not feel that. And would I have been the only one that could have done that? I don't know. But I certainly felt obligated to make them feel welcome. And then the little girl said, if I come to college and I get into Stanford, could I work for you? And I said, you bet your butt you can work for me. I'll hire you in the New York Minute, is that the thing? I'll hire you in a New York Minute. And they just felt like, oh my God, we do belong at this kind of a place. Anyway, that was probably much more of an answer than you needed.
Okay, so along that same line, I'll ask the question. There's 480 million objects in this country that are at risk because they can't be cared for by the community organizations and small historical societies and museums across the country. So is it the universities, or is it county-wide centers or regional centers? How do we care for our history if it's not digitized and the oral histories aren't transcribed and they're magnetic tape locked up in an archive that nobody even knows how to search.
The only thing I can suggest is you make alliances and you form partnerships. I don't do this by myself, at Stanford even, and I collaborate with other universities, big and small, and even community colleges to do what I do, because I can't do it by myself, even as big, bad, and rich as Stanford is. I just can't. I can't collect everything. But between 10 of us, how much more can we do? And I don't have to have 100. I'll work with 2 people, to get something done. We had a project, the Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund records are in City College in New York, and the Mexican American papers are at Stanford. We both applied for grants to get those collections described and processed. Neither one of us were accepted for funding by NEH. And then when I talked to the director of NEH as to why, he said, well, Stanford is big, bad, and rich. You don't need public money. And then when City College asked why they didn't get funding, oh, you're really public and you don't have the capacity to be a research center. So what we did was New York and I made a partnership, and we applied for a grant together. And we had New York be the fiscal agent, and Stanford was a subcontractor. And we got the job done. So you find ways, and you can't do it by yourself. Don't expect to do it by yourself. Get cohorts in crime, and you can do all kinds of stuff.
Thank you all.
We might have time for one more quick question.
And not for me.
I have a question for Anne, and I guess this is a strange question. I think we all appreciate the importance of changing the racist descriptions in Stanford's libraries and archives to anti-racist. Is there any value at the same time to saving the old way that they were cataloged, so that you are also documenting the history of cataloging itself? I'm just curious about that. Obviously, you have some documentation about it, but it would just be interesting to see over the years how the same record is described. So yes, I was just curious about that. I've never been in the area of cataloging within a library.
Yeah, that's definitely a topic that's been discussed at a lot of libraries, and I know there are some places that have systems in place that keep past iterations of their catalog records. We have not yet explored anything similar here. My feeling is that we are not an archive of the history of cataloging. We are trying to serve up archival and rare book collections to the best of our ability, and that's been our focus. And I think there is a lot of space for collaboration between institutions to do something like that, because we certainly don't want to erase the history and make it look like we've always been the most progressive in our use of language. I think that would also be a disservice. So I don't have a clear answer for you, but it's a common question out there.
Well, I'm a researcher, and one of the biggest problems I found is that in accessing these university libraries, it's very difficult for the libraries to release the information about families. So I research African American families. I've written 3 books, and it is just, I was just shocked that I was able to view the archives, but I couldn't get any background information. I couldn't find out more about, I couldn't find the stories behind the photographs. I wasn't even given access to the photographs. So I am happy to see the universities, the libraries themselves are creating these catalogs. Librarians, for me, have been my best friends, but I really would like to see access. So when we're writing about our cultural groups, that we have access to the backstories, access to the photographs, access to, the sources, so we can verify the sources. So I think it's I'm not sure how it's done here, but in other places I found that quite difficult. And I've traveled all the way to Smithsonian's, to DC, to New York, all over the country, researching the books that I write, and that's been the biggest problem. Thank you. Thank you.
I was just wondering how far along are we here at Stanford to digitize all of these documents and all of this information that you're gaining so that we can access it online from wherever we are?
Long way away. The volume of archival records that we have at Stanford go into the multiple tens of thousands of things, and the dollar cost to digitize all of that would be absolutely phenomenal.
The reason I ask is because I was researching the origins of my surname in the Basque Country in Spain, and I was told that Juan Bautista de Anza, who explored and came up here, was born in this little town of Hernani outside of San Sebastian. So I said, where was he baptized? He said, that's church right there. It was called St. John the Baptist and Juan Bautista. And I said, can I get any of those records? He said, oh, you have to go to the diocese. I went to the diocese in San Sebastian, and I said to the young lady at the top, I said, I'm looking for records of Juan Bautista de Anza. What year? I said, 1693. She got up and went over to 2 files, opened up the files, searched that, pulled out a jacket, and said, go to the microfiche there and you'll find his records. They are that far advanced in digitizing things to the 1600s to the present. And I said, is this the case all over Spain? He said, pretty much. So that's why I was asking how far along we were.
Well, here in the middle of Silicon Valley, we are nowhere near that. Unfortunately so, but that's the truth.
Thank you, everyone.